Okay, so welcome, Trevor. Do I have your permission to record?
Yes, you do.
Awesome. Okay, Trevor, could you introduce us? Could you, for the people watching this video, could you say your name, the organization you're with, a couple websites you'd like to plug, and then we'll get into the meat of it.
Absolutely. My name is Trevor Virgil Owen, and I am the Dean of Diplomacy for the Cascadia Illahee Department of Bioregion. And we are an organization that's working towards the interdependence and independence of the Cascadian bioregion. And we started as a bit of a parody of the U.S. State Department, and wanted to play with the idea of creating a shadow government agency that could address the needs of our bioregion and of the movement for independence within it. And my job focuses on training diplomats for our movement and building it beyond just the main population centers of Vancouver, Portland, and Seattle as we expand and find ways to collaborate and unify.
Nice. So the organization that you're with, correct me if I'm wrong, is called Cascadia Now, or the Cascadia Bioregion?
Yeah, there are a number of different organizations. Cascadia Now is the largest. It's been operating for about a decade, and it's registered as a 501c3. And because of that, fundraising and organizing has to be directed away from political action. And so about a year ago, we wanted to create an organization that could be more engaged as a political action organizer, as something that could both raise money and then also make political statements. And so we created the Department of Bioregion to act kind of as a, like I mentioned, a shadow government agency that we could just play with and both represent the will of a potential Cascadian government, but also that got us, so we could collaborate both with Cascadia Now, but then to create an organization that was more politically focused.
Nice. And the original organization, I understand it's not the one you're with now, but the original Cascadia movement was called what, or what was the original name that you changed from?
So the Cascadia Now organization is still very much alive and running. And as a 501c3 and charitable organization, they do a lot of fundraising around Cascadian principles and ideas. Predating that, the Cascadia movement is very decentralized. And you can go back to the 1970s and 80s, really when it founded, and it started with some professors and scientists at Seattle University, realizing that geologically, sociologically, ecologically, there's this region. And it developed as a bioregional movement. But as far as the political organizing, I'd say in the past decade, it's gone from Cascadia Now, and now we've added in the Department of Bioregion. But we do collaborate with them quite a bit.
Okay.
But
you are with the Cascadia Bioregion.
So I'm with Department of Bioregion.
Okay, one more time. So you're with the Cascadia Department of Bioregion.
Department of Bioregion, yeah.
Which is different from the other group called?
Different from Cascadia Now.
Okay. There you go. All right. So what is the goal of the Cascadia Bioregion, and how does that work to, or what is your long-term vision to achieve independence? Are you going for independence? Are you going for kind of a Scottish-style devolution, or do you? What is the long-term goal, and what are your intentions on how to grab that and make it a tangible reality for the people in your region?
I think the long-term goal of the Cascadian movement, and certainly of the Department of Bioregion, is independence. And the way towards that, I think, for me personally, I've done a lot of studying, and as an organization, we've been looking to various models, around the world. You look at Scottish devolution. You can look at, Catalonians have taken a very democratic approach to this. And one of the regions of the world that I find has a lot in common with Cascadia is Galicia in the northwest of Spain. And they, like Catalonia, have an independence movement, and its focus is very grassroots. It's very rooted in a cultural identity. And I think that the Cascadian movement really has a way of speaking as much to the cultural reality of Cascadia as it does the political will of Cascadia. And that's why I think oftentimes we use the language of interdependence and independence. So, the long-term goal being independence, I think that we see the pathway leading there to be as much about interdependence. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the 49th parallel that separates the US and Canada divides us politically, and yet culturally, we see ourselves as one people. So the first step for us is really to kind of unite the will of Cascadians on both sides of the Canadian-US border to come together unified in a Cascadian identity, and then start taking action that will separate us from what we look as colonial and erroneous borders drawn between Canada and the United States.
So you want to create a sense of, I guess, national identity without having the nation formally politically there first. And
Yeah, I think that the idea of a nation state is it is very colonial in its nature. And I think that the Cascadian movement seeks to decolonize a place. And a part of that is looking more at bioregional borders and boundaries. So creating a state or a politic that's organized around watersheds. So up here we have 3 watersheds that are interconnected. There's the Fraser, Columbia, and Snake Rivers. And those are the 3 main watersheds that define the Cascadian borders. And because of that, it goes over many municipalities. You've got a province in Canada, 2 states in the United States, and then other little portions of about 5 US states. And because of that, the idea of using the borders that are already in place for the political structures of Canada and the US, it does separate itself a little bit from this idea of bioregionalism. Sometimes people here call it creating an eco-state as opposed to a nation state. And so I think that a lot of our independence is as much about creating language and a foundation for a shift in the way that countries work, as much as it is about creating, just having a Declaration of Independence and running with it would kind of betray a lot of the principles that are behind the movement for independence here.
what are there examples of bioregions you could point to give people a better idea of models?
Of bioregionalism? Yeah, bioregionalism kind of as a concept and a movement was started very much in the late 1970s and early 80s. And bioregions exist all over the world. And anytime there's a waterway, that kind of defines what a bioregion is. Let's see, other examples of bioregionalism. You see it really emerge a lot with other independence movements. Catalonia is more or less a bioregion. It follows those borders and boundaries. And very much akin to the Cascadian bioregion, you have the French and Spanish border that bisects it. So there are Catalan speakers and people who identify as Catalonians living in France, just as there are Catalonians living in Spain. So oftentimes those borders and boundaries follow these watersheds, and we're looking very much to start organizing around that and see that as perhaps like an organic organizer, as opposed to the erroneous borders that were drawn between European powers hundreds of years ago.
Fascinating.
There are other examples would be, so in the Appalachian area, you have Laurentia. Laurentia takes in a number of watersheds and covers areas from North Carolina through Georgia. And then there's also, let's see, what else do we have? There's, oh man, my mind is blanking. But you got, yeah, sorry, I'll have to think about the name of the other one.
What about Kurdistan? So when I look at Kurdistan, the Kurds roughly live on this one mountain region, broken up by 5 countries. And when you get to the flatland, they turn into Arabs, but this mountain area seems to be all Kurds. Would that be an example of a bioregion?
I think that Kurdistan has developed in many ways around a response to overlapping political boundaries and borders. But the Kurds as a cultural element, yeah, definitely would represent a bioregion. Where I think that's a perfect example of how you've had a lot of erroneous borders and boundaries that have bisected people and divided them from themselves. And bioregionalism, the thing about it that's nice is it doesn't just recognize land, it recognizes culture and people, and how all those things interplay to create a body of people that can represent themselves as a body politic. So I think a perfect example of this and kind of the absurdity of some of the divisions is Vancouver, British Columbia, and Seattle, Washington are a part of the same watershed. And because we're in different countries, we're unable to negotiate treaties around things like salmon fisheries and wastewater, which are pretty
Okay.
basic things for the economy and for the public here.
Okay.
And Ottawa and Washington D.C. are completely disinterested in taking those things up. I think kind of seeing us as this distant, somewhat inconsequential people. And as a result, we have these very core issues that we're dealing with that we're unable to negotiate ourselves. And so it's a perfect example how just like the Kurds are underrepresented and are unable to create kind of a self-determinant politic in their area, we feel very much a kinship with that here in the Pacific Northwest.
We had talked earlier with California Independence, which is us, and then Baja Independence. And one of the things that they had pointed out was that part of Baja and California is one bioregion. The mountains seem to create a hook covering all of California, and then the flatland goes from the Central Valley, Bay Area, LA, and then goes into Tijuana, and that's just the curvature of the earth. And that's why when the Spanish Empire held it, and then the Mexican Empire, they had considered California and Baja California to be one, because it was so hard to get to that area that by the time you got there, it was easy to travel around. And when we look at maps of indigenous people going back 13,000 years, the California region was its own indigenous region simply because of topography. So it would almost seem as though you're saying perhaps the California and Baja area is a bioregion.
I totally agree. I think that it's no failure of language that California and Baja California, really in many ways have that marriage already inbuilt. That you can see that bioregionally these places are connected. Ecologically, the waterways have an interplay. Of course, indigenous populations have so much to do with this. I think it's interesting when you look at Cascadia, people will talk about, east of the Cascades and west of the Cascades. But the reality is that historically, indigenous populations traded very openly across that, what looks like a border in the Cascade Mountain Range, is actually just open passes through which resources on either side of the mountains were able to come together to create communities and a culture that was very integrated. You look at language groups, and there are language groups from west of the mountains that exist east of the mountains as well. So I think that very much like California, Cascadia has what were seen by colonial populations as borders and boundaries or natural borders that don't really speak to the reality of the way people have lived for millennia on this land. You look at the Columbia River that comes down between Washington and Oregon and acts as a border there. And looking at that as a division is just absurd, when in reality, the river was what brought people together. And I think that waterways have an incredibly powerful way of uniting people. And yet they're so often used in a colonial model and in a nation state model of being the divisory line.
Wow. I've never had that thought. Waterways are typically used as boundaries between nations, but humans use them as ways to form basically what would be called a proto-nation.
Absolutely. One of the big economic principles that we're grappling with here in the Pacific Northwest, that's very relevant to Cascadia, is what to do about the hydroelectric dams that go along these waterways. Cascadia is largely energy independent, and it has a lot to do with hydroelectric dams that are along the Columbia and Snake Rivers, but they do impede access from salmon. And one of the big discussions that's come up throughout this debate is that one of the most efficient ways of encouraging trade is by using these waterways. And there's no secret that that's been true for millennia, that you had inland tribes and indigenous populations who were able to get tremendous amounts of resources through these waterways, and then were able to improve their quality of life through trade up and down the Columbia River into the Willamette Valley, and then all the way up the coast into Salish Seas or Puget Sound. And so all of that interconnectedness is really what drove a thriving community of indigenous populations with many different nations, many different languages that were all very much a part of a trading community. I had the distinct pleasure of talking with a Makah elder. His name is Micah. And he and his family came and did a salmon bake at a Cascadian music festival, an arts festival over the summer. And he gave a talk about vertically integrated marketing, which is something that we hear so much in the corporate world in Seattle. And it was funny because he said, vertically integrated marketing is not a new idea. He said the Makah, who sat on the northwest corner of the Olympic Peninsula, understood that thousands of years ago and talked all about how indigenous groups were able to build these vertically integrated and pretty much horizontally organized business structures and models because each one of them recognized that the interconnectedness of the resources they had were better when they operated together. And I think that as a bioregion, Cascadia is very inspired by those principles and finding our way into the future by looking very much to the ways of the past that have been here.
Fascinating. That's fascinating. Wow. It reminds me of what would be called, it's not even the right term, but trade empires or trade alliances. So you have empires throughout history, but I'm not using the right term. There was also a thing called trade empires where they didn't go around conquering each other. They called them an empire just because everybody agreed to get along. Because of this thing, they realized they had so much to gain. I'm remembering the Trobriand group somewhere around Papua New Guinea that goes back 13,000 years. And it was a series of islands that had a similar temperature. The water was similar, the fish were similar. And so everybody just swam around in boats going, well, we have this on this island and we'll sail to your island and trade for what you got. And they've been doing that for thousands of years. And it was a stable system with basically a universal culture, but they also had a strong sense of freedom. Like each island was like, no, this is our island, But they were very communicative with each other, very little warfare, seemed to have a common culture that kept them cohesive and highly resourced. I think that's what you're suggesting with the Cascadia bioregion?
Very much so. I think that there's a very much a cognizance around the fact that we're in a very resource-rich place, and historically there's been a lot of exploitation of those resources. You look at logging in particular, and I think that the resources had a period where they were very poorly managed. You look at the demand for those resources. Historically, there was a way to manage it holistically, and going back towards that, there's still very many traditions that are alive and well, particularly with the Coast Salish populations here. There are all kinds of there are canoe exchanges, and when you look at how they choose which trees to build canoes with, and how you choose which trees to build a longhouse with, all of it focuses on the sustainability of the forest in general and that resource in general, and how a community of people can selectively use a resource that then benefits the whole. And I think that as we have these discussions around things like the hydroelectric dams, the return of salmon to the Snake River, all of these are very much in the context of, how do we best use the resources that we have to benefit the people and Cascadia as a whole? So there's very much a holistic approach to how we achieve that interdependence and how that leads towards our independence.
So the plan is to try to form a cohesive cultural identity in this Cascadia region so that if you're an American, if you're a Canadian, if you're a Washington person, if you're British Columbian, you kind of have this sense of, well, I'm really someone from Cascadia.
Exactly.
I just think more like people from Cascadia than I would people from Eastern Washington.
Yep. I think Cascadians sometimes, we'll often talk, certainly across the border between the US and Canada, about how people from Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, Idaho have so much more in common with each other than we do from someone in Texas or in Florida, or even in Chicago. And it has a lot to do with the culture here, with the community here, and with kind of, I would say, a united consciousness around these resources. We don't always agree on things. There's a lot of debate, around what to do with these waterways and how we use them. But there is this combined consciousness that what's central to our identity is how we're dealing with our resources and the land that's here. From the very first settlers until the technology boom that we're going through now, there is a focus on those resources. And I think there's a real sense of an ethical responsibility to maintain them. And I love that about Cascadia. You rarely find someone who would argue that people locally would do a better job at managing lands and resources than the federal entities that come in and tell us how to do it and what we're doing.
Right.
You know,
yeah.
I think that's where you really start to get into where locals here say, well, yeah, independence is the best option because there's a 200-year track record of people from thousands of miles away doing a terrible job of managing land.
Thank you. And,
yeah. And a completely unequitable job of managing people here. And so once people who live here, a lot of people are moving here right now, and it's really interesting seeing this kind of arc of acknowledgement where they've come from east of the Mississippi. They'll move into a place like Seattle, Portland, or Vancouver, and they'll start to realize, whoa, there's a connectedness here of the people, and it's because of their recognition of the place. And things move at a bit of a slower pace politically, and that has a lot to do with the fact that people generally are looking to find consensus. There is a lot of spending time with going out and actually getting all of the stakeholders at the table before decisions are made. And sure, it's slow, but it is more equitable. And I think that constant, I would say, perception of an overlord of a federal system that does just come in and make these changes or these decisions without consulting all of the stakeholders, that's really abuse. And it's that level of abuse and that understanding of our kind of collective trauma because of it that leads people toward this idea that, listen, we can manage this better locally. There's no reason to have people thousands of miles away making decisions for us when we're not feeling represented by our own representatives that are elected.
It's incredible. So where is the Canadian capital? Is it in the center of Canada?
In Ottawa, yeah. So it's kind of central east. It's west of Toronto, but
we have the same sentiment here in California. Our capital's clear on the other side of the continent, and they don't share a lot of how we think, and yet they manage almost half of the land here. So 45% of California is federal land.
Exactly.
You may have heard about the forest fires here in California.
Yeah, they've been terrible.
Yeah.
Just terrible.
That's all on federal land.
Right.
We suffer because they can't do their job right.
Yeah.
Maybe you heard of something like that.
And we're in a spot now where you look at the federal forests and the costs. We don't suffer to the same extent that California does with wildfires, but the cost of wildfire and of forest restoration ends up falling on not just the local political entities, but on the people ourselves who have to go in and say, right, cool. So these forests are being so mismanaged that they're burning down. They're threatening, the lives and the livelihoods of thousands of people in our bioregion. And there's this incredible story of these huts. They're out in the woods that are, for fire stations. And these forest fire stations, there are some of them that have been abandoned, and you can hike to them. And in one of them, some of the maps are still present. And the absolute absurdity is that the maps just south of the Canadian-U.S. border in the U.S. stop at the border, and they're blank above that. Do you think that fire cares about some, imaginary line before us? Absolutely not. International borders don't matter. County borders don't matter. Roads don't matter.
Right.
What matters is the fact that we can solve these things locally by local people going out and surveying their forests, managing their forests, and then ultimately being able to collaborate. For us, Canadian firefighters end up coming across the border to fight American fires.
Yeah.
Because what else makes sense? They're the nearest forest service or fire service to that forest fire. And when you look at the absurdity of the fact that those folks have to stop at the border to come through to continue fighting that fire, it shouldn't be there. And the fact that there's a complete ignorance to that in Washington and in Ottawa is really what's scandalous.
Yeah. Have you ever, there's a book called The 11 Nations or 13 Nations of America?
Yeah.
Colin something. You may find that region interesting because what he says is that the Cascadia bioregion was always a separate nation.
Mm-hmm.
He basically backs up what you're saying, but he's able to track it down to the way it was settled was different. That you had like British settlers come in from British Columbia or something like that, and they sort of spread basically throughout the regions of the bioregion. And so that's why you would have people who have a similar sentiment about politics and the way of life. And then outside of that region, it was settled by other peoples at different times. I would recommend that book. It absolutely documents that there is something to a Cascadia bioregion, and then it goes back, to the 1800s.
I saw a map recently that took in a lot of those teachings, and it's fascinating to me because it did focus very much on the geopolitical boundaries of the United States, but others bled over across the borders, and you could, there's so much relationship between the land and the way of life, like you say, between Baja California and California. Once you get into the Sonoran Desert, you've got a different culture, you've got a different biome, and you've got waterways that are going to different sources in the sea. I think that California and Cascadia share a common waterway in the Pacific, but when you look at the land, there's this very distinct border that comes down it's north of the Bay Area, but if you go out to Cape Mendocino, Cape Mendocino has these hills that are coming down that have volcanic rock from the Cascade volcanoes that were geologically active at the time, and changed that area, and it was terraformed differently than the area of California. And so because of the realities of the earth itself, you have different peoples, different cultures, different languages, and then very much like what you're talking about, you've got different ways where colonizing groups came in, and it was those natural borders and boundaries that divided the ways that people were able to come in and occupy the land.
Yeah. So let's say you develop a common culture. Yeah, everybody in Cascadia says, hey, we're Cascadians. I don't always agree with everybody, but I can tell that there's kind of a way of the way that we like to handle things, the way we like what we consider the proper way to live, and the role of government. And it's really different once you cross that mountain range or whatever the dividing line is. So you have people, and they generally understand that. Is there a plan for, okay, now we're going to legally become either a full-grown nation or perhaps some sort of Quebec separate region with special rights or some sort of recognition in the Canadian formation? Has there been thoughts about where do you go? So you get everybody to this mental place, what we call the Great Epiphany over here. We are a people, we are one. Then what? Is there steps beyond that? Have you guys dared to think that? Do you have steps, or are you holding those cards close to your chest? Or are you just satisfied with, let's just become a culture?
We've definitely talked a lot about what those next steps are. And as I'm sure you know, there is a mechanism within the U.S. Constitution to start this devolution process away from statehood. And so by forwarding initiatives to the people in Washington and Oregon state, we could propose a Declaration of Independence or seceding from the United States. And those documents have been drafted up and have been sent to the governments in both Salem and in Olympia, Washington. The groups that organized them decided at the time that it wasn't necessarily the time right now, because I think that one of our great challenges is operating under two governmental systems of Canada and the U.S. When you look at support for the Cascadian idea, there's actually more support for it in British Columbia than there is in Washington, Oregon, or Idaho. And so I think that there's almost more of a momentum north of the border, and their process of devolution is quite different. There are many more pathways for them because of the relationship with the United Kingdom, which doesn't have a constitution. So, if you're petitioning Parliament in London for independence, that's different than breaking off from Ottawa. And there are mechanisms and principles there that are at play, whereas Washington and Oregon and Idaho have more of that very much within the structure of the Constitution of the United States of how we could go through for that. I know that the will to get those initiatives on the ballot in Washington and Oregon is very much present. The question in the debate right now is now the right time? And so I think that we've discussed it very much at length, drafted up the documents, and now the question is, when do we want to drop those in the laps of the government of both states? Idaho doesn't have as much activity with the Cascadian identity as Washington or Oregon does, and so that's also another step that we're definitely working on, is getting more awareness with Cascadians in Idaho. In an ideal world, I think that Cascadia, this consciousness, would rise together, and we as a complete bioregion would say, great, we're going to go as a bioregion and be an independent eco-state. But I think that there are many steps to get there. And so the decision was that Washington and Oregon wouldn't take that action right now.
Is there a place where people could see those petitions? Are they available to the public? Are they tucked away somewhere in someone's office, perhaps?
At the moment, I would gather that they're in an office. They were, they would have been submitted, I think, about 2 years ago, and then they were rescinded. It was interesting to see at the time just how much pushback there was, and how much trepidation I think people felt. It's no surprise to anyone who gets involved in independence movements that there are very strong forces that are against the idea of breaking up the empire that is the United States or Canada. And I think it caught a lot of people off guard. And so there's a real cognizance that if we're going to go through with that, having the groundwork in place so that there is that sense of support, and that anyone who's making that statement feels like there's a movement behind them, so that they aren't making it in isolation. And so that's kind of where we've sat with that.
Could you walk us through that just real quick? Like what constitutional mechanisms or laws were they looking at roughly? What did the Declaration say? Perhaps some of the people involved that you're willing to share.
Yeah, so the declarations were coordinated between Washington and Oregon, and they were meant to be concurrent. And what they said was that a initiative would be sent to the people of each state, allowing them to vote on whether or not Washington or Oregon should remain as a state in the Union of the United States, or should become an independent country unto itself.
Okay.
And then if that passed, a process of devolution would happen, whereby those states would, the governments of those states would then start a process very akin to the process that Brexit is going through, where they would say, right, we want to leave. This is, these are the actions that we have to take. Different to Brexit, of course, the European Union had a mechanism whereby you can leave, Article 50. That doesn't really exist in the U.S. Constitution.
Right. That's what I was curious.
But if the will of the people had been decided that the governments of Washington and Oregon should engage in leaving the U.S. Union, then they would engage in that political process. And then the idea is that as that progressed, you could make an argument to the U.S. Senate and get the majority of the U.S. Senate to allow it.
So you're still ultimately going and asking for permission from Congress?
Of going and asking for permission? I think that was the idea of that action.
Okay.
At least if, I think there were a lot of different ideas about whether or not that would work. And a lot of feelings about, I think that there's that ideological feeling of, well, of course it should work. It's democracy. But I think anyone who's under the democracy right now probably needs to go drink better coffee. And
Yeah.
it's funny because I think that there's really not a lot of hope at the moment that kind of just direct democracy is going to make a difference. And so I think perhaps that's one of the reasons why that system fell off. I think that Cascadia as a concept and the West Coast in general is a much stronger argument. Cascadia working in isolation is just one piece of a puzzle, but the reality is that we're not the only place that's saying this system is broken, we deserve better. California is I think the paramount example of.
Hold that thought real quick. Hold that thought. You just said that. Hold on. I gotta do this. You're gonna love this. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can.
Okay, we just invented a new slogan. We're at CALEXIT Con 5. That's the 4th of our conference because we started with 3.0. So we've been having these conferences, talking, and we go, how do we sum up what we're about? And recall what you just said a few seconds ago. This was our new slogan we have unveiled after months of talking at the CALEXIT conferences. Available on YouTube for anybody to watch. This is the new slogan we unveiled at CALEXIT Con 5.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
You like that? Does it make sense?
Never were there truer words written.
Okay. All right. Well, now that we have that, okay. So, let me ask a few more controversial questions. You covered the basics. Well, first, before we get into more fluff questions for entertainment, major points you'd like to make. You know, somebody's watching this. They got a few minutes to digest. What is it you would like them to take away when they think about the Cascadia region? And I'll preface it as somebody who's not from the region. What message would